Hello, everyone, and welcome. My name is Olga Shurchkov, and I am the new faculty director of the Albright Institute. Many of you know what the Albright Institute is all about, but let me just tell you a couple of words for those of you who are new to it. So the Madeleine Korbel Albright Institute for Global Affairs was founded in 2010 by the secretary herself and a bunch of faculty members. And it originally started as kind of a flagship winter session program dedicated to a cohort of students learning about global affairs and also getting support for internships in global affairs as well, in the field of their interest. And so I know that there's a career fair going on right now, so I don't know if some of you went to it. We work with the career education department quite closely to support these internships. But since its inception, the Albright Institute grew quite a bit in scope and reach, and we now support research by faculty and students. In fact, there's a new program that just started, which is the Faculty Affiliates Program. So if you would like to learn more about it, there are some opportunities for faculty and students through that. We also now have programming throughout the year, not just in the winter session. And of course, this Kenner lecture is an example of such an event that takes place outside of the January term, so it's open to everyone in the community, as well as those of you on live stream. Hi, everyone. Thank you for coming. So what is the Kenner Lecture? It's an annual lecture that was established as part of the Albright Institute. The goal is to bring visitors to campus to address some issues of global importance. The lecture was endowed by Hyunja Laskin Kenner, a member of the class of 1988, and Jeffrey Kenner, and it was endowed in 2010, just like the Albright Institute was established. We are very grateful to the Kenners for their support and generosity in supporting this event. And this event really perfectly fits into this year's Albright Institute theme, which is Frontiers of Change, Shaping the Next Wave of Innovation and Disruption. So this theme, let me tell you a little bit about this theme. It really is a way for us to critically examine kind of intersections of equity, ethics, and technological advancement across a variety of frontiers, right? And of course, I couldn't think of a more important frontier than health. Okay, then global health. And in particular today, we're going to focus on innovations and disruptions in global vaccine technologies. And today we're joined by a panel of experts who will not only illuminate the economic and social impacts of global health, but also address key challenges that we face as society, which include, trade-offs, access issues, and allocation of essential resources when it comes to global health care. So our moderator is Professor Megan Núñez. Thank you so much for being here. She is the Dean of Faculty Affairs and the Nan Walsh Schow, 58, and Howard Schow Professor in the Physical and Natural Sciences at Wellesley. Megan, thank you so much again for moderating and leading this discussion, and I'll pass on the baton to you now to start the conversation. Thank you so much. Yep.
Thank you, Olga, and I'm so honored to be here with really the most amazing group of panelists, and I'm so pleased that you could all join us here today. I think this is going to be really interesting. So I'm going to start out telling you a little bit about each of our panelists and what their background is. As you can see, they each bring a really different and interesting perspective of this question about global infectious disease and how we tackle really important questions. And so, I'm going to jump right past you, if that's okay, and start with Professor Dan Barouch. Dan Barouch received his PhD in Immunology from Oxford and his MD from Harvard Medical School. He is currently the William Bosworth Castle Professor of Medicine at Harvard Medical School, Director of the Center for Virology and Vaccine Research at Beth Israel Deaconess Medical Center, a member of the Reagan Institute of MGH, MIT, and Harvard, and part of the Bill and Melinda Gates Foundation collaboration for AIDS vaccine discovery. So he knows a lot about vaccine development. His laboratory focuses on studying the immunology and pathogenesis of viral infections and in developing novel vaccine and treatment strategies. His group has led the development of vaccine candidates for multiple pathogens of global significance, including some you've probably heard of: HIV, Zika, tuberculosis, and most recently, SARS-CoV-2. His work contributed to the development of the Johnson & Johnson COVID vaccine and the evaluation of multiple COVID vaccines and monoclonal antibody therapeutics. He was elected to the National Academy of Medicine in 2020 and received the King Faisal Prize in Medicine in 2023. And then moving down the line, we are really pleased to be joined by Dr. Jaya Gupta, class of 2011. Jaya is an associate consultant at McKinsey & Company, specializing in social and healthcare sectors. With nearly a decade of experience in the field of health system strengthening, she has dedicated her career to improving accessibility, affordability, and quality of healthcare in underserved communities. So prior to joining McKinsey, Jaya served as an independent consultant at the WHO and the World Bank. She holds an MPH and a PhD in health systems from the Johns Hopkins Bloomberg School of Public Health, and she is a member of the inaugural Albright Institute class of 2010. So 14 years ago, she was sitting right where you are right now. So think about that a little bit. Okay, at the end of the line, we are joined by Mr. Kenneth Lay. Kenneth Lay is the Senior Managing Director of the Rock Creek Group, an asset management firm based in Washington, D.C. In addition to his responsibilities there, he serves as the chair of the board of directors of the International Finance Facility for Immunization, which I have now learned everybody calls IFFIm. So now if people say IFFIm, that's what we're talking about, International Finance Facility for Immunization. Okay. As a member of the Investment Funds Committee of the State of Wyoming and the advisory group of financial experts of the Global Environment Facility. He works with international institutions and NGOs to develop new approaches to increasing the scale and reducing the cost of financing for global public goods, things like vaccines. Prior to joining Rock Creek, Mr. Lay spent 28 years at the World Bank, where he served as the treasurer and deputy treasurer, as a country director in Latin America and Southeast Europe, director of the bank's financial sector practice and its financial operations department. Earlier in his career, he was an enforcement lawyer for the U.S. Securities and Exchange Commission, heading its branch of corporation finance enforcement. Mr. Lay holds a BA from Dartmouth, a JD from George Washington University, and is a chartered financial analyst and an active member in the bar of the state of California. And then immediately to my right, I am so pleased to have my colleague, Professor Shastri. So Professor Shastri is a professor of economics here. She is a development economist with research interests in education, in health and financial decision-making. Her research background is in the field of economic development, focusing on questions of education, health, and savings behavior among poor households. This field seeks to understand how economic policies can be used to improve the financial well-being of individuals in developing countries. So one line of her research, for example, focuses on nutrition in South Asia. In one study, she examined how mothers in Bangladesh responded to concerns about arsenic-contaminated wells by breastfeeding their infants longer and delaying supplemental feeding. She also has a study having to do with vaccines that we're going to learn more about today. In recent work, she documented an unanticipated long-term impact of the Green Revolution on diabetes risk among adults in India, likely through in utero nutrition. So she holds a PhD in economics from Harvard and a BA in economics and mathematics from Brown. So, as you can see, I'm joined by totally amazing people, and we're gonna have a really great conversation. So when I think about this, I'm a biochemist, right? And so for me, this rapid development of COVID vaccines really highlighted the exciting developments going on in biomedicine and in fields relating to mine. I'm a nucleic acid chemist. And all these things that have been coming to fruition in the last couple of decades that started with these long investments going back to Nixon's war on cancer, back to our investments in trying to figure out HIV, in the Human Genome Project, things that all happened before you were born, but that I actually remember in my lifetime, right? There's been this long investment, and it's come to fruition so beautifully in things like our response to COVID and the development of these vaccines on an incredibly short timescale. And yet, the response to COVID, I think, also really highlighted many of the issues that are that face us in infectious disease at the same time that we'd like to talk about today. So, for example, inequities in vaccine access and distribution, the challenges that practitioners actually face on the ground, even after we've developed really fantastic vaccines. Artificial barriers raised by misinformation, which is a huge topic I hope we'll find some time to talk about. And the broader implications of infectious disease and what it can have on individual lives and communities, all the way up to countries and sort of global economics and how the world works. So that's why we've brought these brilliant people here today to talk about the promises and also the challenges in global vaccine development and global health, and the kinds of strategies that people are using at all different levels to try to solve some of these problems and help the world. So we thought we'd start out, because what they do sounds really impressive and hard for me at least to understand what that looks like on a day-to-day basis. So I thought we'd kind of go down the line and let people tell you a little bit about what they do and why they do it, what sets them on fire about it.
Am I starting? Yes, please. So if you haven't taken an economics class, you might be wondering why an economist is not only on this panel about healthcare technology, but also first in introducing herself and her perspective. A famous economist once said that every economist who goes to DC to affect policy, whether they came in as a trade economist or a finance economist or a labor economist, comes out a health economist. And that's because healthcare policy is among the most important of our economic policy issues, the most challenging and the most expensive as well. The why it's important is pretty clear. The goal is clear. Health is a human right. A healthy population in and of itself is an important goal. There's an economic angle as well. High mortality rates, high morbidity rates are costly. They impose a substantial economic burden on governments, on populations, in terms of lost productivity, unnecessary medical expenditures, especially when the diseases are preventable. Healthier people we know work more, they work longer, they work harder, more effectively, they save more, they invest more in their children and their children's futures. And all of that is good for economic growth. And in the other direction, growing economies are able to invest more in the health of their citizens, in the public health measures such as draining swamps of malaria-infected mosquitoes or building healthcare facilities to provide basic preventative care. So as Megan said, I'm a development economist with a research interest in child health. The way economists, I think, approach healthcare innovation or think about it is from different angles, all kind of related to decision making. I think innovation in healthcare technology not only involves the science, which I'm interested in hearing about from my panelists, but also innovation in the behavior change and the things that are necessary to affect the behavior change at the household level to get the vaccine into the kid's arm, or at the policy level, the behavior change needed at the government level, the policy change to allocate funds towards vaccination or and implement vaccination camps and implement them well. So economists are really interested in the decision making that's happening at these various points. Economists also are really interested in the causal impact of these interventions. So I'll give you a couple examples. I think Dr. Núñez just mentioned a few of them, but a couple examples from my research that kind of highlights the relationship between these causal relationships, the public policy, the behavior change, and the health outcomes. So in previous work, I've looked at how mothers in Bangladesh responded to an information campaign that was the public policy to telling them about water, the water quality, the arsenic contamination in their well water. And they responded by breastfeeding their infants longer and delaying supplemental feeding. That's the behavior change. And that ended up reducing infant mortality. So that's the health outcome that we really value or care about. In other work, the behavior change can go in the wrong direction. In other work, I looked at how fortifying school meals with micronutrients, that's the policy, the public policy, the program, reduced anemia. So that's the health outcome we care about, but only when school headmasters didn't, they implemented not only implemented the program well, but they didn't compensate by reducing their effort in other programs that were also necessary for child health, right? And so that's the behavior change that can not be beneficial, be detrimental, or at least not help. So I'm on the panel, as Dr. Núñez mentioned, because of my work on the causal impact of Gavi, which I will talk about more later. Thank you.
Hello, good afternoon. My name is Dan Barouch, and my background is both as a physician and a scientist. So I'm trained as an infectious disease physician, and I still see patients for several weeks out of the year. After I finished my infectious disease training, then I started a research group dedicated to virology and immunology, and we founded a research center that we call the Center for Virology and Vaccine Research. And it's basically dedicated to trying to apply rigorous basic science to trying to tackle global health problems, and specifically global infectious diseases, which we think are among, not the only ones, but certainly among the most important global health problems. So our research effort is translational in that we try to understand pathogens, mostly viruses, of global importance, trying to understand how they work, how they cause infections, how they cause disease, how the immune response tries to control them, and then what's lacking, and why certain viruses essentially become major global problems. And then within the understanding of how viruses work, then usually comes the insights into how they can be controlled or stopped. And specifically, it often involves the development of vaccines or therapeutics to either prevent disease or to treat disease. So we've had the great privilege of doing research on multiple global pathogens. When I started my lab 20 years ago, then we were exclusively an HIV research lab. So we did exclusively HIV research for quite a number of years. And it really involved trying to develop an HIV vaccine, which is still an unsolved problem in the world, as well as an HIV cure. And then within the context of our HIV research, we developed platform technologies, such as gene delivery technologies that could be used as vaccines for any pathogen, as well as techniques, virologic and immunologic techniques that were also highly translatable, such as running a viral load assay in the lab. Could be developed for HIV, but perfectly good for running viral loads for influenza or for SARS-CoV-2. And similarly, measuring immune responses. We developed assays to measure, say, antibody titers to an HIV vaccine, but they were perfectly good for measuring antibody responses to a Zika vaccine or a COVID vaccine. So a lot of the building pieces were in place. And so when SARS-CoV-2 started, when the pandemic started, it was a crazy time, and it started, as you know, at the end of 2019. In the beginning of 2020, I remember on January 10th of 2020, I remember the date because that was actually the date that I held my annual Barouch Lab research retreat, where I gather everyone from my lab and we spend a day in a retreat and we talk about all the work that's going on. And we were essentially just reading snippets of brief reports coming out of Wuhan that there was at that point it was known to be a novel coronavirus that was causing disease. And at that point in time, it had caused 41 cases of illness that were known, and one person had died. And that was enough to cause substantial concern and alarm. And the reason was because it was a novel coronavirus, which meant that there was no immunity in the human population. It was transmitted by respiratory routes, which means that it had pandemic potential. And what worried me personally the most was that the initial clinical reports coming out of Wuhan suggested that it was a less severe illness than the original SARS. So you might say, well, why is that a concern? Obviously, if you get infected, it's better to have a less severe illness than a more severe illness. But the concern that frightened me was that the less severe illness meant that some people were asymptomatic or minimally symptomatic. And if people who were asymptomatic could still transmit the virus to others, then you're in a situation where the potential of a pandemic is much more severe, because then you can't just control it by standard public health measures. For example, with the original SARS quite a number of years earlier, it was so severe, everybody got sick, everybody got a fever. So you just can screen people, and anyone who's ill or with a fever, you quarantine them, and then you can stop the epidemic in its tracks. So those elements in the very early days of the pandemic made us very concerned that it had pandemic potential. Of course, we could never have predicted what was going to happen over the next several years. But we started applying the technologies that we developed for HIV vaccines that we had applied to developing Zika vaccines and other vaccines. We then applied to SARS-CoV-2. We had industry partners, and we were able to contribute to both the development of and then the understanding of some of the SARS-CoV-2 vaccines. So the science behind the SARS-CoV-2 vaccines, I think, is an indisputable success, a tremendous success. It's been estimated over 20 million lives were saved by the SARS-CoV-2 vaccines within the first year of implementation. But the distribution of the vaccines and the policies and the politics associated with the vaccines, I think, has been an indisputable failure. And the global health inequities associated with the vaccine rollout is in my opinion at least, one of the most stark global health inequities of our time. By middle of 2022, over 70% of people in the United States were vaccinated. And we had enough vaccines to vaccinate 100% of the population and give them multiple boosters thereafter. Meanwhile, in middle of 2022, then less than 15% of people on the continent of Africa had access to even a single dose of any vaccine. So the inequities are striking. And I think it's on our moral conscience to understand how that happened and whether that is indeed preventable in the future, or maybe it's not. So I think vaccines for global health, it's a really interesting topic. I'm delighted we're talking about today because it's a mixture of the basic science, the development questions, and then the policy and implementation. It's been said that the United States exported vaccine hesitancy a lot more effectively than we exported vaccines.
Hi, everybody. It's a pleasure to be here. My name is Jaya Gupta. It's great to see what the Albright Institute has sort of taken shape over the last 15 years. And I was mentioning to Olga when invited to join this panel that to this day I still have a standing call with my Albright friends every 2 weeks. So if that gives you any indication of how meaningful of an organization it was for me. So my journey here was not a linear one, as alluded to. I've worked in the nonprofit space. I spent time working in India at a nonprofit organization, actually sometimes working on routine immunization camps for childhood vaccines. I've spent a lot of time in academia doing research, thinking about health systems research specifically, focused on health workforce. So how do we motivate, attract, and retain health workers who are actually vitally important also to vaccines, because at the end of the day, you need people to administer them and people who are well-trained and qualified to do so. Then I spent time in multilaterals where I thought about work from a policy point of view, and then most recently have entered the consulting world where I spend a lot of time thinking about things from a strategy and management consulting perspective. The common thread throughout all of these has been health system strengthening and health equity, and it makes sense that across all these different fields, we were speaking a little bit earlier that actually global health really permeates so many different industries, and it's very important to continue to think about it, but how you approach it can be very different depending on the hat that you wear. And so in my current role day to day, I serve health systems, I serve public sector clients like state and local governments, and I serve foundations, as they all, many of them were on the front lines of the COVID response, are now pivoting and thinking about how do they build resilient systems looking ahead so that they're prepared for the next one, and also so that they can be more strategic in how they're thinking about it. So it's very fulfilling work. And as we've all been gathered here today to talk about vaccine innovation, I think I agree with my colleagues already about thinking about health equity as sort of top of mind. It's really hard to think about vaccine innovation without also thinking about health equity. And as Dr. Shastri mentioned about causal inference, one thing that comes to mind for me, hearkening back to my PhD days, was thinking about, vaccines is one of those worlds in which we don't often have to think about the research in the lab setting, in the sense that if a vaccine is found to be efficacious, we truly can credibly believe that that vaccine is going to have the impact if it's administered. But the question mark really lies in whether that vaccine is going to be administered, and that goes to a question different to efficacy, but rather on effectiveness. So that means as we take that vaccine from the lab to the field, how are we making sure that it is being reached to the right populations? How do we make sure that it's affordable? And this is a question not just of internationally, that's an important one, but also subnationally within a country. How are we making sure that it's reaching everybody? Alongside that, it raises questions around trust and mistrust. It takes looking back and unpacking, deep histories within many communities of why there is distrust and vaccine hesitancy. So it's a deeply complicated issue. And it also means thinking ahead, right? As our population changes and we have demographic shifts, our population is aging. The life expectancy is going to change in the next 15 to 20 years, and older adults are going to take up a larger share of the population as well. So we need to start thinking ahead as well, beyond just COVID vaccines as well. And finally, with my background in health system strengthening, it's hard not to also think about it from the point of view of how are we building systems so that the next time a pandemic occurs, we are more resilient, we are better prepared, and that goes to the piece around, whether it's your health workforce, your supply chain, your financing, your governance and accountability measures. All of those really need to be in place, and historically we haven't done a good job at learning from past mistakes, and so how do we make sure we're continuing to do that as we move forward? So very excited to dive into these deep issues with this panel.
Well, thank you, everybody. It's a pleasure to be here. My name's Ken Lay, and I think in the introduction, as she mentioned, I spend a lot of time at the World Bank. And if I think about this in its broadest context and think about what we've just heard from colleagues here, the question, my focus is how do we pay for all this? And the interesting piece of this, and it's the challenge that I have spent a huge part of my career trying to think about, is that if we look around and we look at how big is the global savings pool, how much do we have in pension funds and insurance companies and all of that, the number is in the hundreds of trillions. Now you ask yourself, how much of that have we been deploying at reasonable cost to tackle the problems that we've just been hearing about here? And the short answer is, it hasn't been all that much. And the question that there is a huge challenge out there to try to figure out what it is going to take to deploy all of that huge pool of savings to tackle these kinds of problems. Now, places like the World Bank and other multilateral institutions have been working on this issue, but even if you go and look at the total capital that they have deployed compared with the scale of a lot of these problems, it's still not at all where it needs to be. And so then you begin to think, okay, what do we have to be thinking about doing here? Well, it's very interesting. We had a conversation before we got started today about, if you ask yourself about the health equity problem that we've just been talking about, okay? Well, if I'm the CEO of a pharmaceutical company, I have obligations to my shareholders. They need to see a dividend. They need to see profitability. How am I going to get that for them if I allocate a lot of my production to a poor country which simply doesn't have the capacity to pay for that? And is there something that we can do to try to mitigate that problem? So those challenges are out there, and I think we're all focused on, okay, how can we finance that? And then when I look at, and by the way, we're talking about this in health, but this is obviously also very much the case in our climate, trying to tackle the climate problem. We all know what needs to happen in a lot of these countries, but they're perceived to be very risky. So if I'm responsible for that pension fund, the state of California employee retirement system is now, I don't know, $500, $600 billion. But my responsibility for it is to ensure that the retirees, that there is adequate returns for the retirees. How much am I going to invest in low-cost financing in an African country that may need, healthcare finance, and it may need climate finance, all of that? Very difficult to see how that happens. So there is a whole agenda of work that we all can continue trying to do. And we're going to talk about it more in connection with the vaccines, because an innovative structure that got put up 15 years ago had said, okay, if we can find some wealthy countries who will make pledges out for a couple of decades, which they've done, we can then take those pledges to market and borrow money at very low cost today to deploy for purposes like this. And that was a big contributor to the response to the COVID problem. And there are also, these kinds of mechanisms can also be used to try to address the inequity problems. Can we provide lower cost financing for pharmaceutical companies who are willing to develop production capacity in Africa so that we don't have that inequity issue that came up so much? So I think it's a key part, but it's very closely related to all of the work that colleagues here are doing. And I think as we think through the solutions, we need to bring these things together so that those solutions can be financeable realistically in the world and in the financial world in which we live. But I'll stop there for now. Thank you.
Wonderful, that's great. Kartini, I'm going to start with you. And that was a great segue.
I was hoping Mr. Lake could talk a little bit more about Gavi and the introduction of Gavi for...
Yeah, give the audience a little background on Gavi. That would be fantastic.
Yes, and there was an Albright associated with Gavi also, and Alice Albright ran Gavi. Gavi stands for the Global Alliance for Vaccines and Immunization, and it was established, I guess, about 20 years ago now, with very strong support from Bill and Melinda Gates Foundation, and it has since. And its job has been to, as you can tell from the name, has been to try to build out the delivery of very important vaccines in developing countries. And it's been doing this now for all that period. It started with a very heavy focus on childhood, on vaccinations for children in African countries particularly. But it's very interesting, and this gets to a little bit of the financial connection, because when everybody looked at that, they said there were a lot of donors, and I'm talking now about the US and Japan and other major sovereigns, looked and said, well, look, if we can accelerate all that vaccination in these countries today, then out in the future, there's going to be less need for financing in the future. So in effect, they were saying, we'll make that investment today and it'll produce very significant savings. And so that got started. And then the then UK Prime Minister, Gordon Brown, began thinking, okay, maybe part of that, if we can't get enough of those immediate grants coming in, maybe a way to help with this is what I was describing about the International Finance Facility for Immunization. Countries can say, okay, I'll commit to making an annual payment out for the next 20 years. And then we can use that future cash flow to support issuing bonds today to provide additional funding for Gavi. And so put them all together, and about 80% of Gavi's financing has come from sovereign donors. The other 20% roughly has come from IFFIm over time. And then, of course, as I'm sure you can all appreciate, when the various of the epidemics occurred, most recently COVID, obviously, and now Mpox, that also, Gavi, as an institution, was called on to support measures to tackle that as well. So that's, and it's been in collaboration. I think it's very important to understand that this universe is a collaboration among the World Health Organization and UNICEF and all of that. So there's, there's a lot of collaboration. There can be some gratuitous complexity, but nevertheless, it's very much a global effort.
I can make a comment about that. We're also involved to some extent in the Mpox vaccine efforts, and I find a lot of it is a history repeating itself, because a month ago or so, then WHO declared the Mpox outbreak in the DRC, in the Democratic Republic of Congo, as a global health emergency of international concern. Sorry, a public health emergency of international concern, which is their highest level of warning, which was done for the Mpox outbreak in 2022, which came and led to about 100,000 infections in the United States. And before that was SARS-CoV-2. So it's a very infrequently used designation. And the Mpox vaccine efforts have largely concentrated in the Western world. And virtually no Mpox vaccines, of which we know are very effective, have actually been deployed in the area of the world where the epidemic is surging. So it's quite a stark reality that life-saving vaccines are deployed in the Western world, and even today, with the Mpox outbreak in the last month, literally current events showing that the Mpox vaccines are really not reaching the area of the world that needs it most, and where the pandemic is surging. And even if we are to take a selfish perspective, then we would think that if you could control the epidemic at its source, then it's much less chance that would cause a massive global outbreak, including massive numbers of people infected in the United States, which happened in 2022. So even if you take a purely selfish motive, then you would think that getting vaccines to the places that need it is in our own interests, let alone the global health interests. And I think that the big announcement was the first doses of the Jynneos vaccine actually got deployed to Africa. But that's the first doses, and that's going to be far inadequate, let alone the last mile challenges of actually getting it to the people who need it and getting it into their arms. So I think what we talked about with COVID is really replaying itself right now, right today with Mpox.
Hi, Vanya. Did you have a question?
Who else would have it? So the question that I have is about the distribution of vaccines, right? And you're talking about how difficult it is to distribute them to Africa. I absolutely agree, but to many countries, simple things such as refrigeration is a problem, or freezing. A lot of these vaccines need to be kept at -20. So I think this would be just one of the big hurdles that need to be overcome before we can even start saying that we need to have a little bit more equitable access to vaccines. And the other thing that I can think of is achieving herd immunity, of how we can do that, right? So yes, there are all parts of how can we vaccinate the whole population and how can we keep it safe from emerging diseases or from, let's say, monkeypox that is going on right now. So I want you to comment on that, on how can we go about being more equitable by other certain logical advances or some other advances that we can do.
Yeah, I mean, it's a multifaceted question, and I mean, there's clearly policy and financing and many other things. I can probably speak most on the technological side of it, and so there's certain vaccines that are just more amenable for global distribution. The vaccines that require deep freezing at minus 80 degrees Celsius are clearly have huge barriers to be delivered to remote areas in Africa, let alone the transportation. If there's no freezers in that entire area, how are you going to deliver vaccines that require freezing? It's almost an impossible task. So there are other vaccine platform technologies that do not require freezing. So the mRNA vaccines that are made with lipid nanoparticles are too unstable and require freezing for stability. During the COVID pandemic, there were some vaccines, particularly the AstraZeneca vaccine and the J&J vaccine, were stable in liquid form and did not require freezing. And so those were actually the mainstay vaccines that reached the developing world. There was virtually no use of the mRNA vaccines in the developing world in the COVID pandemic. But even those had major challenges. There were manufacturing challenges with the J&J vaccine and distribution challenges with the AstraZeneca vaccine. And particularly, I'm sure Mr. Lay can comment on it, but the major vaccine that Gavi was going to distribute and failed to do so was because the AstraZeneca vaccine that was made at the Serum Institute in India, that was slated for 1 billion doses to go to Africa, was then kept in India to vaccinate their own population, and there's probably breach of contracts involved. I don't really know about that. But anyway, there was 1 billion doses of the AstraZeneca vaccine produced by the Serum Institute in India that was slated to go via Gavi to Africa, and it never made it because of the Delta outbreak and massive death and massive mortality in India. And then the Indian government decided that we need to keep it for ourselves. And I don't think that many Western countries would have made a decision different than that, to be honest. So there's many aspects of it, but certainly vaccine stability and cold chain is one of them. There are other technological advancements, such as there are some vaccine technologies that do not require freezing, and some advances in mRNA technology are sort of moving towards not requiring deep freezing. But certainly, the vaccine has to be fit for purpose. And if you want to combat a global pandemic, then you need vaccine technologies that actually can be distributed, assuming that the policy and the financing and other pieces work out. If you want a vaccine only for the rich countries in the Western world, then you have more options.
Dr. Gupta, did you have something to throw in?
Yeah, I could speak a little bit to, on the ground realities of how, if a vaccine does reach a country such as India, which is the one I can speak to the best, what that might look like in terms of distribution and how cold chain is managed. What I will say is one piece is certainly the technology and the modality, and we saw that even with polio as it went from injection form to oral form, how that vastly changed the response mechanism. I will say in India, working in rural Rajasthan, which is if you don't know it, Rajasthan's highly desert and very, very hilly. And so to get a vaccine to a very remote area sometimes requires motorcycles with refrigeration that are going out very far to only vaccinate one child, because there's only one child coming to an immunization campaign. And there are sometimes questions of whether or not you open that vial, because if there's only one child, do you actually waste that vaccine because there's not enough children? And so the point that I'm trying to make is that there are sophisticated methods that, global South countries have come to in order to get those vaccines where infrastructure doesn't exist. Now, it's not ideal, but it's what I would call, there's like leapfrogging mechanisms that you have to make where you don't have that infrastructure. But I think the question around health equity sometimes begs the question around, the principle of the matter, or the sort of the piece around there being two systems of health, as in you can't have one system here that works best for everybody and a different standard of care that we're suggesting exists elsewhere. And so what that means is if we can get the vaccines there, can we build infrastructure? Can we build creative solutions to get them to the right places? Potentially. But I think the first step is getting them in the hands. And scarcity solves for creativity sometimes.
And I should just say on that specific point about the refrigeration, it was quite interesting to attend the Gavi midterm review a year ago and see the number of representatives of companies whose work was to produce refrigeration facilities for these kinds of situations. And again, it takes me back to the finance thing. Where is the money coming from to pay for that and to pay for it on terms that are affordable for where we are? So it's a very complex, suffice to say, very complex situation.
From the little I know about Gavi, it sounds like part of what they do is not just think about how vaccines themselves are funded, but actually the whole infrastructure.
Yeah, that's exactly right. We've just heard, I mean, the complexity of taking something like this and getting it actually out that last mile and into the arms of the kids is hugely complex and requires tremendous resources. A lot of issues, you've got issues around local corruption, you've got issues, all kinds of issues that have to get tackled. So.
That's a good segue, I think.
Yeah, so let me talk a little bit about my research on the impact of Gavi and estimating the causal impact of Gavi. As we've been talking about, Gavi's been responsible for an incredible amount of funding of vaccines to the developing world, specifically for the goal of increasing vaccination coverage. Part of that is doses, but also the health system strengthening we've been talking about. As I mentioned earlier, economists are really interested in evaluating the causal effect of public health interventions, especially ones of this scale. If we're spending this much money, I think $17 billion before the pandemic, and I don't know how much since, we want to make sure we're spending that money right? And there have been a number of studies in the medical literature and in the economics literature trying to evaluate the effect of all this Gavi money. And they all face a really important challenge that they vary in how well they're able to address it, but is that we don't know what the counterfactual is. We don't know what would have happened if Gavi hadn't been there distributing this money, right? Would these countries were growing over the past 20 years as well? Would they have they were spending money on vaccination before? Would they have also spent that more money on vaccination even if Gavi hadn't been there? And the two papers in the economics literature that look at the effect of Gavi and try to address this challenge actually find opposite results, contradictory results. One finds that Gavi increased coverage of vaccines and reduced child mortality. The other one actually argues that no, Gavi money was just replacing money that these countries would have spent anyway on vaccination, kind of like those headmasters. These countries said, hey, Gavi's giving us this much money to spend on vaccination. We would have spent this much money, but now we'll spend that on something else, right? And so this one paper, a very well implemented paper, argues that there's no effect on coverage and no effect on mortality. So my research actually doesn't agree with that conclusion. So we use a totally different strategy, which I'd argue is better able to actually get at the causal effect of Gavi. And the thing we're able to deal with is that there's the differences across countries that are changing over time. And how we do that is we compare vaccines that Gavi funds to vaccines that Gavi didn't fund in that same country in that same year. So there's a lot of variation so Gavi doesn't just show up in one country and fund all their vaccines. It funds the rotavirus vaccine in 2014 in a country and maybe the pneumococcal vaccine in 2019 in a country, right? And so we can compare changes in the coverage of those two vaccines over time to try to take into account differences across countries and differences across time and differences across countries that change over time, right? And so our research, the other benefit of this strategy is that it allows us to look at the effect of these two new vaccines that Gavi was really instrumental in distributing in the developing world, the pneumococcal and the rotavirus vaccine. Prior, when Gavi was founded, around 2000, most of the funding went to vaccines that existed, which are already kind of available in the developing world, the measles vaccine, the hepatitis B vaccine, the DPT vaccine. But early in around 2008, 2010, Gavi became really involved with distributing these new vaccines, the pneumococcal and the rotavirus vaccines, which weren't really available in the developing world before. So when we use our strategy to compare funded vaccines to unfunded vaccines, we show that Gavi actually did increase coverage of these new vaccines by about 20%. That's a pretty big, 20 percentage points, which is a pretty big increase in coverage relative to no initial coverage. For the older vaccines that already existed, Gavi also did increase coverage, but only about 5 percentage points because many people already had received the measles vaccine or the DPT vaccine. But another really important part about being able to evaluate the effect of these two new vaccines is they actually target two of the leading causes of death among children in the developing world, pneumonia and diarrheal diseases. And the pneumococcal vaccine can prevent death from pneumonia, and the rotavirus vaccine can prevent death from diarrheal diseases. And so we can use the same strategy to compare deaths from causes related to the vaccine to deaths from other causes to show that Gavi funding reduced child mortality by about 1 child per 1,000 live births. So if you aggregate that around the $16, $17 billion that was distributed in the first 20 years of Gavi's work, that saved about 1.5 million lives. And if you divide that by the number of dollars, it's about $9,000 per life saved. So it's clearly a huge return on that investment from Gavi. So I think that is a good note to add in.
Gosh, time flies. I have like 10 more questions, but I bet you have more questions too. So does someone have a question before I jump in with one of mine?
Hello. This question pertains specifically to the COVID-19 pandemic, and also I think very specifically to the Western world. But how do you see the role of science communication and communication with the larger public having changed as a result of the pandemic?
Well, I can maybe start with some perspectives since I was sort of in the throes of it for the entire pandemic. And I guess I'll make a few observations. So first, scientists and physicians, and I think government officials, public health officials, policymakers, we were all completely unprepared for the forces involved with misinformation. As scientists and physicians, we kind of assume naively that if there's a phase 3 trial and there's a nice figure and it has a p-value that's significant, that the whole world will believe it. And that's kind of the end. And then, okay, well, just get the vaccines out. But that proved to be clearly incorrect and overly simplistic. I actually think that we still don't have any idea of what the forces involved are with misinformation. I was just chatting with some of my colleagues earlier that news articles or tweets that contain misinformation are distributed, read, clicked, retweeted, whatever metric you want, at a much higher rate than news articles or tweets that have correct information. And why that's the case, I'm not quite sure. I mean, you could think of a variety of different scenarios. But I think that we are completely unprepared to handle the issues of misinformation, and primarily because we don't really understand it. And there are forces involved that use misinformation for various political or other gains. And so I think that the messages reaching people are mixed, and the messages from the scientific community, there's still controversy there, but at least it's a little bit more filtered than in the general community. So I think that as a community, and maybe even starting in the academic world, we need to understand the sociology of misinformation. And there is so much that is unknown that was laid bare during the pandemic that we need to understand what forces they are in order to combat them. Secondly, I think that people such as physicians and scientists and academics and policymakers and government officials, we need to participate in the discussions. And during the pandemic, I tried to. I spoke with lots of reporters during the pandemic, And in some cases, I think that was helpful. In some cases, maybe it wasn't so helpful. But I think that people need to be more vocal, and people need to, in whatever domain people are, whether it's science or policy or finance or whatever domains they are, I think that people need to be more outspoken and need to communicate with the general public what the reality is, whether it's good or bad or what the truth is. And I think in many cases the public does have a thirst for knowledge. And if what they're hearing is the forces of misinformation, then that's what they hear. And so they need to hear the true information as well. But I'll let other people comment on that too.
I can add two perspectives here. One more personal anecdote, which pertains to when I was working with the WHO. We put out a lot of reports. That's one of the roles that the WHO plays, is sort of collating evidence and synthesizing evidence and then generating reports to summarize. And in that capacity, oftentimes we would work with reporters to then distribute said report findings, so large media outlets that you can imagine. And it was very insightful to me playing that role of understanding what a media person is interested in snapping and taking a bite of. Oftentimes it's the most exaggerated statistic in the report or something that is really a projection or an estimate and actually not accurate, but we're projecting it out in the report to demonstrate what the intended effect could be. And so just to play that perspective of, where does misinformation start? Sometimes it is, nefarious intentions, and other times it's simply like a facet of how media works. Such as a personal anecdote. I think the one other thing I would add to what Dr. Barouch mentioned is the role of, understanding what your core strength is. And so sometimes public health practitioners, we try to reinvent the wheel. When joining consulting, I quickly learned that there's actually different expertises that we should always leverage, and within the business space and communication space, that is a whole industry and a whole field, and I think one thing we need to do better at is tapping our experts in our other fields to do better.
Other questions?
Thank you all for these reflections. I'm a medical anthropologist, and I do research, or at least a part of my research focuses on vaccine production in Central East Africa, and particularly in Rwanda. And I'm curious, this is an open question, so whoever feels like they can share some reflections is welcome to do so. A large part of what we've been thinking about as medical anthropologists over the past 20 to 30 years is how global health can be peopled. And a lot of what I've heard from these reflections today is what it seems, in my interpretation, a set of innovations on this side of the Atlantic. And I'm curious to know where the people fit into this general narrative. I'm particularly interested in COVID-19, primarily because it's recent in our minds, in our experiences, looking not just at folks like scientists and medical doctors, health economists, development folk, but looking at how there are all kinds of other innovators in these ecosystems in which we find ourselves working, like rappers, for example, or singers, who in the context of various regions across Africa were heavily involved in doing public health communication. So where do the people whom we think we are serving in this long and very complicated maze-like supply chain fit into these innovations?
The people are the center. That's the driving motivation and the ultimate recipients. And the people are also the ones who receive the information to decide whether they want the vaccine or not. And so I think the people are the center of the entire process, from the basic research in the lab all the way to the last mile of delivery. And I think the voice of the people is critical. For example, in the phase 3 clinical trials of the COVID vaccines, then there was a very strong emphasis in incorporating the community perspective in the design and execution of those trials. For example, there are community representatives on the boards of essentially all major clinical trials, at least the ones done here. And the community's perspective is absolutely critical for the process of research that actually gets a vaccine to market. And I think the voice is even more critical for the ultimate distribution of the vaccines. I think where it goes awry is when other forces intervene, and when there's some larger force that then prevents the vaccine that has been brilliantly made from actually reaching the people. And I think that is where the people's voice gets lost. But there's a very strong incorporation of the people's voice in all aspects of the research and development process, and it should be there for the distribution process as well, but unfortunately not always.
Yeah, and I would just add to that I would put people at the nexus of place, because oftentimes we think of groups very homogenously, but reality is when you're thinking specifically about science communication, for example, or taking on ambassadors, you mentioned rappers and singers, I would say in each country or each area, it's going to be a different ambassador. So if you think of in India, they're the Bollywood stars. If you think of in South America, oftentimes it's footballers. And public health communication has started to tap into, whether it's a religious leader or different types of ambassadors, deeply, deeply important to contextualize how we're actually sending out that message so that it's effective. You have to create different types of mediums as well. So not just who's the ambassador that you're picking, but also what's the platform. Is it WhatsApp? In other countries, it's a different platform where you have to dispel myths. And so very good question, because I think that people really are ultimately the heart of this.
Both from the lab, the domestic rollout, to the international rollout, and I was wondering if there are solutions to corruption when it comes to vaccine technologies.
More of a distribution question.
So that's a good question. I think one of the economics world is there's a big debate about whether foreign aid is effective or not, right? And some of the issues could be that foreign aid gets leaked, right? And one of the ways I think, and maybe Mr. Lake can talk more about that, is that Gavi has not, previous vaccine efforts might have suffered from that more. Gavi, at least net, is still having this positive effect. And part of that might be because a lot of the benefits, a lot of the foreign aid is in kind, like doses of a vaccine, which you could sell, but if the other buyers could buy them at the same price, then they're not going to probably buy them from, they're not going to leak as well. And some of the other support is in-kind health system strengthening, which is going to be harder to slip into other pockets, right? And so I think that may be one way to think about minimizing foreign aid going into increasing corruption is by it being maybe distributed in kind as opposed to in like other ways. But.
I would just say that over a long period of time, the multilateral development banks have established procedures to try to mitigate the corruption that can be associated with their work. Now, if that gets institutionalized and you have others who can in effect piggyback on that, on those solutions, I think that can help. But no one should be under any illusions that that this is going to be a perfect world. I think that's we're going to have to be aware of that. I also noticed over a number of years working in those institutions that there's a trade-off, because the measures that you can put in place to mitigate those kinds of things can also cause inadvertent delays and difficulties in getting the job done. So it's difficult, also I think there's just a lot of further work that needs to be done in the domestic environments in these countries to try to move to a more appropriate legal system, more appropriate and robust, internal governance and authorizing environment to try to prevent this kind of thing.
I was wondering about how you address, or if you address, unwillingness to immunize when it's not based on misinformation. So I'm thinking specifically about, like, for example, like unconsensual participation historically in scientific experimentation among Black and Indigenous populations in North America, and kind of like what's being done to kind of win back public health trust within those populations, especially because we saw during COVID in Indigenous populations specifically, there was a much lower rate of immunization.
That's a great question, and I think a very important one. I'm trying to think of the right example to bring here, but I think that it's certainly important to consider the history, as I mentioned at the very beginning, of deep mistrust with medical institutions. I remember one of my favorite classes here at Wellesley, we learned about Tuskegee, we learned about Puerto Rico and birth control, and it has happened time and time again. So no doubt, and that's here in the U.S., but you have that tenfold in India. You had emergency contraceptives that are put in postpartum without consent. It's a very common issue, and ensuring dignity and consent and respect is a big part of public health. And oftentimes, I hate to say this, but good intentions can turn bad. And I think sometimes where that comes from is where you have distortion. So, for example, a policy that was intended to help birth spacing so that children are being fed well and pushing contraceptives for family planning purposes can then result in, well, you're being incentivized to put in an IUD, so now let's keep doing that. So I think it's got to be very careful tailoring of policy and how we ensure that it's not distortive, such that people's consent and their autonomy is unimpinged upon. So I don't have the perfect solution. It's a great question, and I think that's an important one to keep thinking about.
I think it really starts long before the product is available. It really starts in the research process. And for the COVID-19 vaccine, it was done at the research level. It was front and center, one of the highest priorities, to have the involvement of multiracial communities and to have adequate racial and ethnicity balances in clinical trials. In fact, it was such a priority. It was the overriding priority of the U.S. government side of the effort. And there was actually some of the pharmaceutical phase 3 plans actually were sent back for modification to ensure that the phase 3 trials reflected the diversity of our country. That's how high a priority it was. It was really the overriding priority, because it was felt that if various communities did not trust the research process, then they would also not trust the vaccine. Now, it turns out there was a lot of vaccine hesitancy for other reasons as well. That was the one that was specifically focused on at the time of the clinical research before approval. And I think, as I mentioned before, we were sort of blindsided by the forces that emerged afterwards. But during the research process, that was one of the single highest priorities. And all the phase 3 trials that were done in the United States, which were Pfizer, Moderna, J&J, AstraZeneca, Novavax, and Sanofi, made a very substantial effort to enroll participants, well, two things. First, to include on the community advisory boards people of diverse backgrounds of all races and ethnicities. Secondly, to include clinical trial sites in communities that represented the diversity we have. And thirdly, to ensure that enrollment in clinical trials was adequately balanced. And that actually was in most cases quite successful. Some a little more than others, but the actual participation in clinical research was really quite good. there were many other problems that emerged afterwards. So the post-approval issues are, I think, a different discussion. But I think at least the start of it was on a pretty good trajectory before things sort of got derailed.
Hello. I'm kind of interested to hear how, based on like your various expertise and fields of study, you could propose to tackle the issue of funding, as well as continuous urgency for finding vaccines for, say, viruses like HIV that have a lot of modern technologies that make it virtually undetectable for people with access to these resources, but maybe not for marginalized identities or other communities in rural areas.
Well, I think there is the funding for basic research and then the funding for development. So funding for basic research is mostly federal funding, NIH or others, and largely done in academic institutions. And then funding for development is often in the setting of industry, pharmaceutical companies or biotech companies. And in the post-pandemic time, then funding for research, both basic and clinical research, has substantially gone down. And there is a lot of forces that make that the projections are that it will go down further. But I think there will always be substantial funding for infectious disease because it does affect everybody. Whether, regardless of your skin color, regardless of whether you're rich or poor, it does affect everybody. So there's always substantial support for basic research for infectious disease vaccines. Of course, it's never enough, and it's never what we want. But there will always be some. But the question is how to preserve the higher amounts that were obviously present during the pandemic. And that's obviously very difficult because then there's many other priorities. During the pandemic, there was really a singular focus to find a way to end the pandemic. And now, of course, there is a large range of competing priorities.
All right. I want to be respectful of everyone's time, so I'm going to hand it back to Professor Shurchkov for a few closing words. Are we good, or we have time for a couple more? We have time for a couple more? Okay, good, because I saw some more hands. Yeah, okay. Okay, we're good then.
Okay, so I have another question, and it's about vaccine hesitancy. What I have noticed that vaccine hesitancy hasn't gone down. Instead, in many countries that I travel to, it has gone up. And not only about COVID itself, but also into other infectious diseases as well. So I wonder if you have any comments, or if you have observed it in your travels as well, and what are your recommendations of kind of combating that?
Well, I mean, vaccine hesitancy has always been a problem, but it's never been this much of a problem. And the vaccine hesitancy that emerged during COVID is spilling over into vaccine hesitancy for example, childhood immunization has gone down, and other types of immunization has gone down. So it's a very complex question. I don't think it has a simple answer, but a lot of it stems from public distrust. And so I think one might even be able to rephrase your question, how do we rebuild public trust? And that's public trust in science and medicine, it's public trust in academia, public trust in public health officials, public trust of government. And the more distrust there is of all of the above, I think it gets translated into vaccine hesitancy. And fundamentally, I think people need to believe that getting this vaccine is good for them. And if they don't believe that, then they won't get it. And so I think that combating the vaccine hesitancy really requires a deeper look as to why there is such public distrust of government and public distrust of pharmaceutical companies, public distrust of academics, public distrust of biomedical research.
I was wondering if I could ask you, you mentioned speaking to reporters about the vaccines, and I was wondering what kind of things you talked about. You mentioned some of those conversations you felt were helpful and some may not have been, but I was wondering what kind of things you were speaking to reporters about that you felt might be what we need to do more of to combat that vaccine hesitancy.
Well, I never really viewed myself in that role. I was sort of thrust into it. But during the pandemic, I was speaking with reporters almost every day, sometimes multiple times a day, for essentially every major news organization in this country and internationally as well. And in most cases, I was just being asked questions about fact, like this new study came out either from our group or maybe externally from another group, and to just give my comments and perspectives on something. And then it inevitably led to questions about broader questions about the pandemic as a whole. And I guess the reporters often would come back to me because they sort of saw me as sort of a trusted or maybe trustworthy voice. And I always did my best to try to present the truth as I could see it in as honest way as possible. So I think that when messages get mixed, then the public gets very confused and it leads to distrust of the whole system. For example, when different branches of government, and this is not a specific situation, but it occurred many, many times. I could go on for a whole hour to tell you about all sorts of situations, some of which I was involved in. But when they hear from two different branches of government, like the White House and the CDC, and they're saying opposite things, then it confuses people. Obviously, some of the mistrust is the sort of the ultra extreme anti-vaxxers, but that is a relatively small fraction of the population, and there's nothing you're going to do to convince them. I think what we need to concentrate on is the bulk of the population, and what are we doing wrong as scientists and physicians, or as academics, or as economists or policymakers? What are we doing wrong? Why are we not reaching people, or not reaching enough people the right way? And I think that deserves some self-reflection and some form of adjustment, because we need to have more engagement with the public. So I think one thing, as I mentioned earlier, I think one thing is that for whatever domain people are in, whether it's research or funding or policy or academics, I think we need to become more engaged. We need to become more engaged with the public. We need to speak to the public, write to the public, share our views. And I think that the bulk of the public wants to know the truth. And if they hear it from voices they trust, then they'll believe it. What happens is that when they hear mixed messages from different sources that they also trust, then it's difficult to process.
I'll just add one thing to that, and it harkens back to the earlier question around histories. I think, at least in the South Asian context, which I'm most familiar with, there was also instances, of using health workers and especially polio vaccine workers as intelligence. And so I know, at least in South Asia, that created a deep level of mistrust in subsequent years. And so I think this, we were talking earlier about how we need a historian on the panel, and thinking about how really this is such an intersectional question. I think really how we do a lot of different parts of our work is deeply intersected. And so that's, at least in the South Asian context, one thing I could point to.
I appreciate that very much, because one of the things that I've been struck by on this panel is the way that people's work is all related to one another, and how it's informed, I think, by the things that you're learning in the field, what you're learning in the lab, what you're learning from your research, right? How does it all go back together? And we're a liberal arts college, right? We think about so many different disciplines and so many different worldviews. So I was wondering if any of you had something to say about that, with the way that your work perhaps connects to one another in ways that you maybe haven't seen yet today, or the way that your life took you in unexpected places, and that your old skills and your old connections maybe are really serving you well.
I would just start to say there is not enough of the sort of collaborative approach to a lot of these problems. Because, if I go off and talk to a bunch of investment bankers about, what are they going to do to finance the tackling COVID in emerging market countries, I can tell you that this is a conversation that tends to be very isolated from the kind of work that colleagues here are doing and that would help inform the whole process. It's very interesting to see, because if they were seeing these kinds of conversations, their assessment of the risk and all of that might change dramatically, and it might improve, and it might help increase the scale and reduce the cost of the resources necessary for this. I think likewise, I think that if we had these conversations with, going the other directions, then there are ways to take into account in the process the concerns that the financial community may have and that are perfectly reasonable from a risk and return perspective, to try to get that incorporated earlier on in the development of approaches to all of this. We were talking about the refrigerant issue, for example. Okay, let's have a conversation about that and see if, what would have to happen for that industry, working with colleagues on the, in the labs and with finance, to come up with a solution that would be optimal. And I think there's a lot of room for those discussions to expand.
I can speak about the winding journey piece that you mentioned as somebody who has just more recently made a bit of a career change, moving into the management consulting world. And actually, it's funny, vaccines was actually what prompted me to make that switch. As I was working with the WHO during COVID response, I saw who was being tapped out of my friends to actually think about vaccine strategy here in the US. And surprisingly, it wasn't many of my public health friends, but actually my friends working in the management consulting space. And the reason for that, I think, is not because both didn't have valuable skills, but I think we needed an agile and sort of strategic response quickly. And that was something that consultants had done for years. And so I think that was what prompted me, was a challenge and wanting to try something different as well, and obviously a myriad of other things, such as personal reasons. But I think that, it's important to, I always say, one of my PhD advisors had told me this: think back to the last fun thing you did and try to do more of it. So that's something I always try to keep top of mind. And I think for me, going to the policy world was great, super eye-opening, but then wanting to be back in the field, or closer to the action, I should say, is something that consulting has given me. So I think just the lesson from that is just continue to follow what makes you happy and excited every day.
Hello. So I have personally worked with PEPFAR, and that is something which has continued to have 20 years of bipartisan support. And now recently we have seen a lot of politicization of vaccines, especially to an unprecedented degree in the past 5 years. I was wondering if you had any personal examples in your individual lines of focus which have been affected by this politicization, whether that be allocation of funds or research. Yes.
Well, I mean, we had a number of funding sources from the federal government, from the NIH or otherwise, and some of that funding was abruptly terminated with by the congressional clawback of so-called unspent COVID pandemic funds. And they characterize unspent funds. Oftentimes grants are 3 to 5 year grants, and they give you sort of 1 year of funding at a time. And the out years of funding that were obligated were technically not spent yet, so were subject to clawback. So the clawback of this so-called unspent pandemic funds abruptly terminated a lot of research programs, sort of in midstream.
Apologies for being sort of that, I don't know, killjoy to end this wonderful and illuminating conversation. I do have a piece of good news, is that we do have a reception to follow this, so you are all welcome to stay and ask further questions for panelists, so I hope you do so. Now I think we're done with the more formal panel, and let's please just give a huge round of applause for our panelists. Thank you so much for being here and bringing all these different perspectives. We could have spent a whole, semester essentially unpacking these issues. Thank you so much to Megan Núñez, who did a wonderful moderation of the discussion. I also would love to thank a couple of other people who are here in the room, maybe outside, but in the room here is Patty Salser. Thank you so much, Patty. She is a wonderful member of the Albright family. She helped me bring this panel together. This is wonderful. Thank you also to our crew, our team, Julie and Beth, who organized this so wonderfully. I don't know if they're in the room, but thank you so much, as well as to our student assistants and fellow mentors, and to all the fellows who are here, and all the Albright and non-Albright students and faculty. Thank you so much. I appreciate you. Come join us for some reception and food. Thank you.